Okay, so I've got my black. Okay, now let's just do this, just for argument's sake. I'm going to take this black here, and I'll put, say this was, I wanted this as a shadow. If I take the black and I put it in here, now all of a sudden it's like, what? It's so black. You don't want to have such a vivid or let's say a stark black. It is okay if you want to take one of these, a different color, and darken it with the black. That's what I'm doing right now. And then blend that in a little bit more. So then it's a little bit darker shadow, but it isn't like you accidentally spilled black paint on it. It looks a little bit more natural. All right. So now I have this nice browned gray that's with a little bit more of the black in it. And prior I wanted this shadow down here, and as it's dried I've noticed it's not quite as dark as I want it to be. So I'm going to come back and utilize that paint that's already in the brush, which, two reasons. There again, because it's utilizing the paint, but it's also taking it out of the brush, so that way I can go migrate to lighter colors as I need to. So there's just a shadow there. It's hard with the lighting in here, it's really hard to see, but it's darker right there. So let's think about, let's add a little bit more of the dark here. Same process. Take what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the original color here that I used, and that's this one. And grab a little bit more of the black. Blend that in. And as I come through, if I notice that if it doesn't have enough brown in it, because you'll notice that the grays, how they have the brown mixed in, if there's too much black, it draws it too much, it cools it down. Instead of being a nice warm gray, it wants to cool it down and make it more neutral. I don't want it to do that. So in this situation, I add just a little bit of brown. And that then warms up that gray, but keeps it dark. Okay, now I do like the way that's turning out, so what I'm going to do now is come back over the top and just lightly stipple in the highlights. Now, if you notice, like right here, it's pretty harsh, and I don't want to do the blending with the brush, so I just hit it with a little bit of water, then utilize that water as a solvent just to kind of soften up those edges. The white gives it, and now this is not white, this is a really light gray. It gives it a nice contrast to the dark, where you can see the texture below. Okay, on this one I will come back with a white. Okay, now this side here is wanting to run on its own, which is good. It's letting the water find its own pathway. That definitely makes it look real. I mean, it's doing that flow on its own. Okay, so let's think about let's think for a second. Maybe we'll do a let's do a rust drip here. So imagine there's some iron fitting, or a ladder or whatever it might be, on the structure that's rusting. So same process. You want to get it wet first. And then this color here is actually called Georgia clay, and I like the way it looks. It's not 100% accurate for rust, but it does kind of look kind of good, I think. Now, if you've ever noticed, rust, because it's iron mixed with water, say like it's a rainstorm, the rain and the iron particles wash down and just kind of settle out into the rock. So you want to give it the impression that that's exactly what's been happening. And the longer it occurs, the more stark or defined the streaks are going to be. If it isn't happening very often, if it's incidental, it's just going to be more of a stain than anything, not necessarily solid drips. So you take into account those types of things, like how long has this been out in the weather? What's above it? How quickly does it rust? That type of thing. So then it gives that appropriate age. One thing that I've noticed is as you're doing the painting for rust streaks or water mineral, if you let everything dry, you come back and paint it again. Sometimes you have to do several different colors, just several really close colors. Iron rust streaks have browns, they have blacks, they have white sometimes. So it just depends on You know, if you, in these types of situations, it would be good to have some type of photographic reference. So you could say, okay, I want these colors because this, say you found a rust mark on, you know, on a wall or on anything that could rust, and you wanted to replicate that, you could do, because the technique is the only thing you're concerned about, just the water, letting the color move. So your selection of colors is relative to the result that you want. The technique's the same, just different colors. Okay, now in this situation, say I imagined that there was a rusty pipe right here, and the rusty pipe was just dripping rust, you know, not dripping water, but dripping rust. Then in this area here, I do a deeper brown. Actually, maybe I'll do that with the red. Okay, so that's very subtle. So what I'm going to have to do now is let all of this dry, and then we'll come back and readdress some of these areas once everything's dry, and then I'll be able to increase the visibility of the rust and of the water lines, the water mineral drips, because then we'll be able to decide if the paint's where it needs to be or if certain areas need to be lightened or darkened. Alright, so I'm going to take the camera down and I will show you how it looks at the moment while everything is wet. Okay, if you notice here, I've got the light that's traveling to the dark here. I've got the white that's sitting on top of the high points of the stone, and then I've got these dark areas that are going to darken up as the paint dries. The water mineral doesn't like to show up very much in the camera, so that'll be good though, because I'll show you how to fix that. So you can see here, and it does continue to run, but the light that's on it makes it look like it stops right there. It doesn't. It continues on. So I'm going to brighten those up, and then with the water, or excuse me, with the rust streak, I'll go ahead and darken that up on the top, and then increase the flow look of that down the stone. So that's where we're at right now. So we're going to let this dry, and we'll come back in just a few minutes and take a look at the colors again. Okay, I went and okay, so I stepped out of the room, and when I came back in the room, I noticed that this rust mark, from my perspective, the way I was sitting, looked like it was vertical, but when I moved this way, it was more this direction with the rock. So I dabbed that out, and when this is dry, then we'll let the water decide where the vertical line should be. We'll get it wet and let it run. But this afforded me the opportunity to clean out my brushes while we wait for the paint to dry, and I thought I'd show you what colors I'm using. These are all Home Depot colors. They're from they're bare. This darkest one is called Iron Mountain, and this is more of a neutral gray. It's a little bit more blue in it. This color here is called Kindling. That has a little bit of the brown in it. Then Woodcraft, it's a little bit lighter. Up to, this is Taupe. These are all in the same family. This one is Nightingale Gray. And then up to Moth Gray. That's really hard to read, but this is Moth Gray. It's really light. It is not white, though. It is just really light. Hey, this is what it looks like. I've got my flash turned on so you can see what it looks like with the wet. Now, as those colors dry, we'll come back and readdress certain areas so we can get them to be as natural looking as possible. All right, we're back, and it's been about an hour, maybe a little bit longer, but I'm going to go ahead and sharpen up these, the rust and the water mineral marks. I've got the aid of my light, which enhances these colors so you can see them better. So I'm going to mist this a little bit with the water. And then this time I'm going to use just straight white. Okay, now I've got a little palette. If you can see it here, it's just a little palette. Nothing special. But I take I've got a little pool of water and then my white paint, and I blend the two a little bit to get even a little bit more of a wet type, more of a paint solution with the water rather than straight paint. Now the concentration of paint to water, the more paint there is, the less it tends to run, the more it tends to stay in place. So if you want it to run just a little bit more, you just add a little bit more water. You want to start out with your stone on the wet side. That will allow this paint to disperse out into the water. Okay, so now I'm going to let that sit for a little bit. Let's go ahead and work on this rust mark. Okay, again, I'm just using Tulle paints. The Tulle paints offer a really good good selection of pre-mixed paint colors. So again, just get the surface wet. That's going to allow the paint to kind of decide where it wants to go. Okay, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to spray this. This is relatively thick. I'm going to spray right there and see if I can get it to follow its own pathway down the rock. Okay, you can see right here it's starting to, wants to run right there and right here. So I'll just kind of encourage it a little bit along the way. And these, you may be able to see it, it's really faint right here. And that's just like new rust. It's a really faint stain. And this older stuff, more rust up here. A little bit of darker, this has got a little bit of brown mixed into it. It's actually I'll tell you what it is, it's actually a burnt umber. Yeah, burnt umber. Now what you're trying to do is make it look like it's been dripped on, not that the rock itself is rusting. That would be a little bit of a different technique. You don't want to make it look like you've got a rock made out of steel. Let me address this a little bit more. This is a really thin mix of paint and water, with it getting even thinner the farther out to the edge I go. It's just, when this dries, it'll just be a lot lighter right there. It won't be a very concentrated color. The water mineral, where it's been built up and is actually hiding the stone underneath, that is where you'd like it to be a little bit thicker. More opaque, more of a solid white, without being able to see the stone too much beneath. Let's make another one right here. You just want it to be really arbitrary as far as the mix is concerned, but you want it to be somewhat naturalistic looking. Now, obviously, this isn't dripping any water. This is just to give the an example of the paint effect. So if you had a line of water mineral that continued all the way down and then have it drop from here to here and down, then that would even look more realistic. But I wanted to keep these two, or all of these, separate so you can see a different effect, a different paint technique for different purposes. Now this spot right here is not quite dry. It's still shiny. Same right here. This is also still wet. So those will darken up as the paint dries. But I think this is probably pretty good. I don't know that it needs to have any more depth added to it. I think it looks pretty good. Okay, we'll come back in a few minutes and see how this looks as it's dried. Okay, the paint is dry, and I think it looks pretty good. I don't know that I would change much. So what we're going to do now is come back in a little bit, and we're going to do the grout with, well, it's mortar, but it's applied with a grout bag, and I'll show you what that is. Okay, I wanted to show the hot glue gun that I actually used. This is capable of handling sticks that are about this long. They're a larger diameter. It has a faster recovery time, so when you've gone through all of the glue that's in the chamber here that's melted, it does a good job of melting quickly. So when you're applying a lot of foam, having a gun that can melt the glue quickly is and then have the volume that it can do. This is quite handy to have. Okay, this is the grout bag. It's got some mortar mixed up inside, and I'll twist it up and use it like a piping bag, like you would for decorating a cake or cupcakes. Okay, so you just gently squeeze in this mortar. Now, because it's on the thinner side, it's going to want to drop down. So if you start at the bottom, build yourself like a little anchor point, and then build up, you can get all of that area filled in. Now, where this is intended to be a fake mortar joint, you want to kind of envision the shape of the stones and how they are within the mortar. So you can kind of conceal a little bit more the shape of these stones, so it doesn't look like these were applied first. Okay. All right, so we're going to let that firm up just a little bit. I'll tool it a little bit just to get it in its approximate position before I do the final shape of the grout joint. Now I'm using this chip brush again. I'm going to be using the end of it quite a bit. That's going to be when I'm pushing in the edges and stuff, but I'm just going to migrate the mortar into its approximate position just with the tips of the brush. Now, I mentioned in an earlier video about a stick that I used for the other joints around the Village House restaurant. That is just a piece of a stripped piece of wood, just a narrow, like a paint mixing stick. Just trimmed down with the edges kind of rounded off just a little bit so it doesn't leave definite corner marks. And that's all that I would use for that. But I don't know that I'm going to need to use that this time. Okay, now there's a lot of mortar building up in the tip of the brush here, and as I dab it, it wants to suck back out. The mortar wants to stick to this mortar. So if you're having trouble with that, I always wear gloves. Just get your finger a little bit wet, dab it in there. That way it won't stick to your finger. Okay, now we're going to let this set up a little bit more, and then we'll come back and do the actual troweling, the troweling, I guess, or the joint work, so it looks a little bit more like it's that the rocks have been stacked in, and then that you've gotten rid of the excess mortar. Okay, this area right here is starting to be right where I want it to be. If you notice, it's a little duller here. It's still glossy here, so it's still soft. So I want to give it just a little bit longer. Okay, since I'm waiting for this to dry, I went ahead and just took a stick that's of similar thickness to a paint stick, just to show you what I was talking about, just by making a stick where you can manipulate this this mortar into a more believable joint. This is still a little bit wet, and you can see how it builds up on the stick. The stuff that's more dry wants to scratch more, and that's more what you want it to do. You don't want to be dragging it around. You want to be able to just scratch the surface. So we're going to give this a little bit more time, and then we'll come back and do the final tooling. Okay, it's been about another half an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and use this tool here to gently tool in these mortar joints. Now, if you notice, it's not pulling the mortar like it was before. Now what I'm doing is using the tool to press the mortar joint up against and into the stone to make it give a tighter appearance, so there's no separation between the stone and the mortar joint. Now, if the mortar joint starts to get kind of hard, like if it's firmer over here than it is up here and down here because of the mass of the mortar that's there. So if it is starting to get firm, I do like to flip it over and use the point here to push up against the stone. Give it a little bit more defined edge. Okay, and that's about it. Now we'll just let this firm up and then maybe do a final dust off of the joint there in the center, and then that's it. It's all done. Okay, it's been about 24 hours and the mortar joint is hardening up and lightening up like you want it to. This area through here and this area through here are still the moisture is still evaporating and the mortar is still hardening, still curing. But this is pretty good, I think, and I think this is where we'll leave it. So don't forget to like and subscribe for further tutorial videos. And thanks again for watching.
What does your hat say?
Give me some treats!